My name is Sidney Finkelstein. I'm a professor here at the Tuck School. I'm Associate Director for Executive Education, and I run the Leadership Center as well and teach courses on strategy and leadership to our MBA students. And it's my job to be moderator today for this fabulous panel. So let me do a very quick intro to each person and then have kind of get the show on the road, and we'll ask each of our panelists to take more or less 10 minutes to make a presentation on what they want to say and share with everyone, and I'll moderate, and we should have plenty of time for discussion and interaction among the whole group as well. So first off, next to me is Glenn with two N's according to that. Glenn
Second N silent.
Second is okay. Thank you for clarifying that, Glenn. So Glenn is a senior fellow and founder of the Financial Innovation Lab at Milken Institute. So that's pretty cool, and we didn't get a chance to chat, but I love to hear stories about some of the amazing things that Michael Milken has done and is doing in the field of education, in the field of finance, in multiple areas. It's of great interest to us here at Tuck for a variety of reasons. Leading authority on financial innovation and capital markets, and I think is going to have a great talk on those topics. Next to Glenn is Nava. I have all my paperwork here. Nava Swirsky-Sofer, who I enjoyed having a very good coffee the other day at Market Table. Those of you who haven't had a chance, right? Market Table, the best coffee in town. I'll get my royalty later. She is very experienced in a variety of fields related to entrepreneurship and venture capital, commercialization. She's now the president and founding board member of the International Commercialization Alliance out of Toronto, as well as the founder and co-chairperson of Nano Israel. It seems like Nava's involved in all kinds of different entrepreneurial activities in Israel and probably globally as well. And in listening and chatting with her the other day, her travel schedule is going to rival anyone in the room, which is saying something, I think. And then next is Bernie Avishai, who's visiting us now at Dartmouth, right? As a visiting professor of government. He's an adjunct professor of business at Hebrew University. He's been at MIT, he's been at Duke. He and I have something in common, which is we both grew up in Montreal. And we went to different schools, but we both grew up in Montreal. And I think we just discovered that he went to parochial school with my cousin, Norman. So, lo and behold, there are all kinds of connections to be made. Bernie is a prolific writer, former Guggenheim fellows, written extensively for the New Yorker and many, many other places, and a great thinker on intellectual capital and related topics, and I'm excited to hear Bernie sharing some of his ideas as well. And then Jamie Coughlin. Jamie is the director of the new venture incubator programs at Dartmouth College, and was the guy that pretty much set up the Den Innovation Center, which just opened in about a month ago, or yeah. And is working with a bunch of people that some of us will know, from Trip Davis to Tillman Gerngross and others. And along with that, Tuck, Steve Call and Phil Furneaux and a few other people involved in entrepreneurship. And Dartmouth's in a kind of a cool place when it comes to entrepreneurship because of this incubator having a big impact on the opportunities for our students to actually do entrepreneurial stuff together and take advantage of what an incubator could be. And I think it's a big advance for us, and another good example, I think, of Dartmouth and Tuck connecting ideas. So it's a fabulous panel. We're going to have a great discussion. Let me turn the floor over to Glenn.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, thanks. I'd like to just, I guess, pose a couple of questions, try to link this from the earlier discussion that was primarily based on startups, and perhaps throw a little bit of cold water on the discussion and open a window into a debate currently going on in Israel about how to deal with the question of capital formation in a more systematic and broader way. But first, where do the innovations come from? I wanted to just start off with this idea that the basis was not simply, I think, we're running a lot of premature victory laps in some ways, not to in any way diminish from the high level of achievement in technological innovation. But it's still at a very narrow base, and we're still in the early stages of the history of the State of Israel the story's not complete. But the origins of it definitely come from, I thought, these two counterposed examples that I wanted to just bring up. Israel is the only country in the world, I know not everybody knows this, that has to launch satellites and missiles opposite the rotation of the Earth. Any ideas why? Is it why we have to do that? Yeah, because we'd get a lot of incoming coming back if we shot missiles in the Earth's rotation pattern. The result of that particular physical limitation and barrier has been massive advances in the space industry and the technology of miniaturization. The other example I sort of have of this paradox of Israeli competitive advantage and where that really comes from was the issue about vegetarian schnitzel. And so up from where Eitan and his family come near Nahariya is Kibbutz Lochamei Getaot, which was during the Tzena, during the period of austerity in the 1950s, there was a Polish chemist who was very observant of the fact that there was not sufficient protein in the diet of the children on the kibbutz and was able to synthesize protein through soy and establish a very important company, TiVo, which was later sold to Osem, which was later sold to Nestle, that took the ghetto fighters' kibbutz and turned it into a wealthy kibbutz, a very successful one. Unlike kibbutz at Sasa, which has retained their ownership of their enterprises, they sold off theirs and been doing very well. But the challenge here about that is that these processes are very keen, but I think as Guy had pointed out, we're talking about a high-tech sector which has a disproportionate, thank God, contribution to the GDP of the country of around 40% of the GDP in terms of the $85 billion that are currently on the balance sheet of the Bank of Israel. About 52% of that foreign exchange reserves is derived from those knowledge capital-based exports. It's very key prior to the discovery of the gas. I mean, we're sitting on 35 trillion cubic feet of gas, which has all sorts of implications in terms of something else that we've worked on is the formation of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which presents a huge opportunity. But all of these are relative to the fact that it has contributed and Israel has achieved a relatively stable but moderate level of economic growth, certainly relative to other emerging markets. Now it's a developed market. But rates of growth in the 3 to 4% range, which are inadequate in order to close the gaps that could tear the country apart. And they're internal gaps. They don't have much to do with the neighbors or other sorts of things going on. The economy is relatively insulated for the most part, at least empirically, from those side of things. The type of thing it's not insulated from is from social cohesion, the absence of social cohesion. Have 10% of the population that are part of that high-tech sector that make, yet as Guy was pointing out before, you have 70% of the population basically can't afford affordable housing of a mortgage on a home. The issues and those gaps are not only in terms of we've achieved the highest levels of income inequality in the developed world at this point, and both the regional gaps, both within Israel, the regional gaps between the north and the south and the state of Tel Aviv are unsustainable. And it was interesting, I never thought I would quote this current president as favorably as I might have quoted the last president, but Ruby Rivlin even pointed this out recently, that economic insecurity is the most serious threat to the state of Israel. Not external threats, but threats that are internal in terms of the social cohesion. You can absorb a lot of income inequality in the United States and in Europe and other places. You can't in the state of Israel for all the obvious reasons. So with that stated, how does this become replicated? How do you replicate that level of innovation beyond the 10% of the population? How do you mainstream the types of advantages and strategic advantages that can emerge when you start to apply this to other areas? And there's an answer to this. It's embedded in some of the discussions about what should be the technology targets, how to mobilize them, how to combine sort of Manhattan projects with Silicon Valley projects around the key areas that all other nations of the world face. One other factoid I just want as a point of introduction, and then I'll move quickly into the substance of this, is that Israel is a country still largely dependent on its trade with Europe and the United States at a point in time where there was a big structural shift just last year. $46 trillion of GDP growth, the stock of GDP growth exists within the developing markets and the frontier markets, not in the developed world, precisely as we transited into being a developed country. Yet Israel, as a startup nation, can be the startup nation for other startup nations as a model of overcoming the scarcity in areas such as food, where it now exports caviar, it exports food. There were the period that we talked about when soy-based products and soy schnitzel was the answer to protein. There's numerous other answers, the growth of the agritech and the food sector, the growth of the water sector, the growth of coming up with energy alternatives, some of which may be transition based on gas or standard chemicals that would be based on natural gas as opposed to oil, and the issues of global health. In all of those areas, Israel has been a major forefront leader of overcome scarcity in order to preserve human capital. Now, one of the key points of this opportunity, and this is maybe written a little bit too small, is what a transition that goes on over the next 10 years that could basically position Israel to go from currently of around $35,000 in GDP with high levels of inequality, with narrowing inequality, with closer to $54,000 to $60,000 per capita, to get at Singapore level per capita income, but as a democratic state and as an innovative state which is open to the rest of the world and becomes both a capital market, which I'll get to in a minute, as well as a country that serves as a platform to be the startup nation for other startup nations. So not quite a light into the nations in biblical or prophetic sense, but perhaps in a more important material sense to deal with where the markets, what are going to be the key drivers of global markets, which are emerging and frontier markets. Now, the problem, and there's several ways to do this, of translating into more knowledge capital intensive industries in precisely those areas where there are global scarcities. There won't be growth in Africa or in Asia or in Latin America without major advances against infectious diseases, without increased longevity. There won't be the ability to avoid lots of conflict and lots of repetitions of other types of problems if you don't have sufficient food. If you have 56% of the hospital beds in the world occupied by people with water-carried diseases, the ability to have water quality and water sourcing, Israel has addressed those problems. 83.5% of the water is recycled, a country that's suffered the worst droughts, much worse than California right now, where I'm staying right now. But going back to Israel at the end of the month, Israel, lowest rainfall in 125 years, is producing 20% more water than it consumes and exporting that to Palestine and Jordan currently. So the ability to do that and to build those types of bridges by overcoming scarcity by technology applications in areas of scarcity are precisely how the country will continue to grow and overcome its problems. The Sovereign Wealth Fund presents an opportunity to do that, to invest in other countries that would consume Israeli technologies to overcome those scarcities, and to move to about 5% of GDP, and to be a major creditor. The country's already a creditor to other countries, but to be a major creditor for increasing trade and growth in the region and in the world. So the ideas that Yadin had raised earlier are not beyond the scope of imagination here. So on one hand, we've had a great number of deal of innovations that are generated by a technologically based economy, but largely are expatriated. Unfortunately, this project that we did for the Israel Securities Authority and for the capital markets unit within the Ministry of Finance and for the National Economic Council really pointed this out. Empirically, we have the conversion of patents into long-term value and capital formation and job creation is not occurring in Israel. The VC and private equity is concentrated largely in early and expansion stage firms, with later stage growth going hungry for capital. That leads to a situation where most of the exits are being done through M&A as opposed through IPOs, as opposed to business building and to building larger firms, for there to be one, two mini ISCARs and for them to be many multinational corporations that are based on that, delivering technology transfer. So startups in and of themselves are not enough. The VC industry is focused almost entirely upon Early stage, about 80% in Israel versus 52% in the United States. Late stage is only about 20% invested in capital in Israel and 52% in the United States. So we've got a real gap there that has to be bridged in the coming years. If we disaggregate the numbers of the life cycle and stage structure of firms, the market microstructure is to lower capital costs and to increase supply is something desperately in question. This is something we've been pointing out in a number of situations. The model, though, is a very solid model. The model to start off with the global need. Again, food, technology applications, knowledge-based capital in food, water, energy, and global health, and transfer that into innovative solutions with local testing, and then to develop partnerships and beta sites with global scale-ups. So that type of model that I think we'll hear about in some of the real success stories that have come out of Israel are ones that can be replicated. At the same time, less than only 5% of the exits are via the IPO market compared to 20% in the United States, and the value at exit of Israeli startups on the average is substantially below 70% of the startups in the United States. So rather than a lot of self-congratulation about how well we're doing, we may have been creating in Hebrew you'd call it a fryer economy, where we're selling out too early, where other people are being able to create a transfer of intellectual capital and becoming an intellectual sweatshop. To say this as provocatively as I possibly can, just to get things going here in the discussion. We have a lot of, this is one particular example of a program that we've been working on with the Chief Scientist's Office, now the Fuel Substitutes Initiative, the idea to make oil obsolete. This was a program, it's about a $330 million program that spreads out over 10 years along with 2 investment funds. And that's one way to go. A similar sort of things can be done in life sciences and others. The actual structure, I'm going to move very quickly here. The actual structure of the capital markets are really problematic. We basically have some of the lowest liquidity in capital markets in the world. Tel Aviv Stock Exchange is 30th among exchange turnover ratios. This is right after lunch, so your eyes might glaze over, but these are really important points, because if you don't have liquidity, we know this from a lot of the research in financial economics across a number of markets over 3 decades. You have low liquidity, you have economic concentration that Guy was talking about earlier, you have low free float in terms of available and the dominance of closely held firm, and it undermanages how exchanges can finance assets. So the decline of liquidity makes it difficult for large foreign investors to enter the country. So whereas in the small startup sectors, you've got a lot of VCs coming in, almost all of the public equity market is dominated by local investors, and very little of the institutional money is going into the sector. The result of the elevation of Israel into the developed markets and OECD has lowered the liquidity. It's declined over 50% in the last year. So the 4 structural trends, you can just see here how much the turnover rates have, the absolute deterioration of liquidity and the relative change in turnover and market value is worth noting varies a number of regions. I'm going to run out of time, but you can all pick these up. There's some copies of the report back there, and we'll share sides of the slides. But these, the opportunity here is that we also have, on the other hand, we have a third world country age structure. We have a lot of young people. We have a cumulative aggregate growth rate in long-term savings at around 90%, 51% of the population under 30. These are fantastic demographics if you can increase labor productivity, which is running at 20% lower, 30% lower than the other OECD countries. So if we can solve the problem of labor productivity, solve the problem of capital formation and capital productivity, the country can escalate and leapfrog very quickly into being able to take advantages of that savings rates and create channels of capital and of capital formation through the institutions into the capital markets that would be a launching pad for global technological solutions and partnerships that build us out of the isolation that exist. Unfortunately, things have been going the other way. 20% of the current stock of institutional investors are invested abroad, of the stock is invested abroad, but 70% of the current flow of Israeli institutional investors are invested abroad. So unlike many more Los Angeles firemen and California firemen and policemen have been benefiting from the benefits of Israeli knowledge-based capital exports rather than the local population. So these are the types of bridges that have to be built. And I guess I'm going to close with there, and I can come back and drive into further talk about some of the issues and the concentration that are there. And it can see the problem of concentration and market cap being very concentrated, very diverse. And in order to make the country more liquid and the capital markets more liquid and fuel the rate of growth to, again, what is the point of all this, is to have a macroeconomic impact. If you're only growing at 3 to 4% annually, if you can grow at 6% annually, you can start to narrow those income gaps, increase aggregate demand, and again, launch more technology and knowledge-based capital to solve the problems not only of Israel, but of the world.
Thank you, Glenn. That's a good thing to try to shoot for, solving the problems of the whole world and not just Israel. I'd like to know if there's a quick question from anyone while it's all fresh in your mind what Glenn was talking about. We'll have a chance afterwards to kind of have a general discussion with the whole panel, but if there's something that jumps out, this would be a good opportunity. Otherwise, we're going to go next to Bernie.
Can I ask a quick
Please,
question?
please.
Is that permitted?
It is now.
You mentioned, Glenn, the relatively low productivity.
Right.
On the other hand, we also have relatively low, sorry, I actually have a mic. I can do this. We also have, yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. We also have relatively low unemployment. So don't you think they are related?
Oh, we have low employment for the reasons that the guy was mentioning earlier. We have very low labor force participation. We have the lowest labor force participation in the OECD as well, running at around 54%. And the main secret to that is to mainstream in the areas of low labor force participation, which are ultra-Orthodox and Arab. By mainstreaming that, you can get another 1 to 2% GDP growth, within 5 years. If you start to do that, if you can mainstream the Arab population and the ultra-religious population, ultra-Orthodox population, which is a clear shot at it. I mean, those changes are beginning to happen. They just need to accelerate. You get at least a 1 to 2% GDP bump out of that.
Good. Thank you. Thank you again, Glenn. Bernie, would you like to go next?
Yes, I'd like to come back to the different rates of growth, and I'll do that toward the end. I think I'm going to have to catch up with that little thing. I don't think that'll work on mine. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to make a simple point. And it's so simple and so obvious that I'm kind of astounded that it's not made more often. When people speak about Israel's innovation engine and what other countries can learn from Israel's innovation engine, very often we hear about the peculiar formation of Israeli human capital, the military, Russian immigration, chutzpah, This seems to be the kind of going refrain. What can other countries learn from that? Well, first of all, get a war. Secondly, make sure that your country's full of people who suffer from Russian anti-Semitism. And then get a Jewish mother. To me, this is not teachable. And I think it's also a bit underestimating of some very important thing that contributed to Israeli growth and innovation that we seem to be sloughing off, except that we mention it en passant. And this happened this morning, again, when Guy Rolnik was talking about the numbers of companies that were setting up technology centers in the country. And it came up again en passant when Yadin was talking about the formation of capital markets, of venture capital markets in the country. I just want to pause for a moment and recognize the importance of global corporations in creating the business ecosystems that have actually engendered this entrepreneurial economy. And I want to start by throwing up this. This is the average ratio of intellectual capital, that is to say intangible assets to tangible assets, in the S&P 500 today, and how it has moved since 1975. In 1975, 83% of the assets of global corporations could be accounted for as tangible assets. Today, 83% of the S&P 500 is intangible assets. How you explain intangible assets is not a trivial problem. When I was at KPMG as their Director of Intellectual Capital, I always used to meet with the IP people and always found them increasingly in crisis trying to account for what their clients were actually booking as assets. In this room, I don't think I have to speak too much about it. I think we understand that more or less what we're talking about is the difference between stuff and knowledge. The difference between tangible assets and intangible assets is stuff and knowledge. It's like that famous story of Mrs. Carnegie who wanted a hat for Easter, and she calls on the best chapelier in Paris, and he comes, "Yes, Mrs. Carnegie, and where will you be sitting in the church? And who will you be sitting next to, and what is the color of your gown, and at what time of day is it?" And he takes out a straw hat and puts it on her head, and then he takes a ribbon from his bag, and he ties the ribbon just so, and she puts it on his head. She puts it on her head, and she looks. She says, "Oh, this is perfect, perfect. How much do I owe you?" He said, $500, ma'am." He said, $500 for a ribbon? And he pulls the ribbon out, hands it to her, and says, "No, madame, the ribbon is free." I mean, we have companies today whose innovation engines themselves are scientific, productive conversations. And that is what they are. It's not just what they sell, it's what they are. This is so obvious. American and global companies today that get big enough to have technology centers in Israel are so much this today that you'd think that it would be obvious that if you are an emerging economy, one of the first things you should be doing is trying to make your place attractive to global companies to come and implant operations. But this is not necessarily what economists believe. I'll just take the most recent famous example of Thomas Piketty. I'm not going to get into it, but when he spoke about the activities of global corporations, what he really thought he was describing was global companies coming to countries and extracting financial capital. But it's not just the macroeconomic profession that believes this. If you look at Startup Nation, you listen to the Israeli Prime Minister in 1998 when I interviewed him for Fortune magazine, and he was describing what was the engine of innovation in his own country. It was very clear that he was also adverting back to immigration, adverting back to the military, and what he was not speaking about was the activities of global companies. Now, one person who had a slightly different view was Dov Froman, to his credit. It was also a case of special pleading. But when I talked to him in '91 about this, he said, you know, for every global company that's active in Israel, we get 4 Israeli startups. I think he wildly underestimated the spin-off effects of companies like Intel. And I'm going to skip over this because this is a small footprint of the number of global companies that were invested in Israel through the Oslo process. By the year 2000, you had major technology corporations not just setting up technology centers, setting up sales divisions, setting up recruiting. And what they became for Israelis were windows on their suppliers, windows on their customers, reference accounts, and other technology transfer opportunities. When you think about intellectual capital, I find it useful to just think about the know-how part and the know-about part. So when you have companies like Motorola and Intel active in Israel through the 80s and 90s, what you have are teaching institutions that are not just teaching you about advanced technology. Sure, they're learning from you, but they're also teaching you about their advanced technology. They're also teaching you management standards. They're teaching Israelis how to let people finish their sentences. They're developing networks for Israeli entrepreneurs. And also, just as important as know-how, there's know-about. Who are your customers? Who are your suppliers? Most important, who are your reference accounts? If you're Sally and you're going to Spain to sell a potential customer in a startup, it's important to know that Yitzhak, who you worked with in IBM, actually can give you a reference. Product development initiatives. How else do Israeli startups, who are largely selling not to end users but are selling to global corporations, how do they find out about the product development initiatives if not through this evolution of relationships that begin in the activities of global companies in your part of the world? And they were some of the first venture capital funds. Intel had a first fund, and I'm not tracking them. Yadin can go into the details, but it's important to think through what all of these mean for Israel's important business ecosystems. Israel's telecom ecosystem would be inconceivable without Motorola. Israel chip design would be inconceivable without Intel. There were, it's true, companies like Elbit and others that were starting off because they were selling to the Israeli military, but that was hardly enough to jumpstart an export industry. And you look at some of the big Israeli companies that have scaled up. Amdocs had a first strategic partnership with Southwestern Bell. Checkpoint would be inconceivable without Sun Microsystems. M Systems required IBM as a first channel and as a venture partner. EDS had one with HP. By the way, Checkpoint also had one with HP. So, you can't eat algorithms. And the way in which you discover what product development opportunities are there is through the presence of those companies. I want to make a last point because I think I'm almost running out of time. Yes, the government's first obligation is to teach. And yes, if possible, increase your immigration by inviting as many well-qualified people into your precincts as possible. I'm all for that, and Israeli immigration laws are rather frustrating along these lines, but leave that aside for a moment. But if it's true that the government is first obligated to educate, attracting significant global presence, the presence of global corporations should be thought a crucial part of your educational strategy. You cannot create the kind of educational infrastructure that you need if you don't have global companies as teaching institutions, reinforcing and expanding your imagination. Now, how Israel did that, I'm not going to steal any thunder from Nava, and I'm also, you also spoke of the Bird Foundation. There were also tax holidays. From 1988 on, the Israeli government did some things to make it possible for companies like Intel to set up and expand their presence. That is possible, and that part of the equation, I think, has been learned by, even the state of North Carolina by now. I mean, we know about how you bring these companies in. Maybe now, in order to do it more successfully, you're going to have to make your educational infrastructure very attractive for them and their own management and so forth. I'm not exactly sure how you simply replicate what Israel did in 1988 and on, except to say that if you are an emerging economy, you need to think through how to create direct foreign investment and see that not as extraction of financial capital, but as the development of your intellectual capital. I want to make one last point. Glenn spoke about the difference between growing at 3% a year and 6% a year. So did Stanley Fischer. I mean, it's an extremely important thing to keep in mind, that if Israel is kind of doing the average of the OECD, it's not really outpacing the social frictions that it has to mitigate through economic growth. We did a little bit of research last year into Israel's growth, potential growth, vis-a-vis its actual growth. We created a model of synthetic Israel. Now, synthetic Israel in this case, you may be interested to know, is 3.7% Belgium, 22% Finland, 38% Greece, 9.6% New Zealand, 11% Singapore, and 14% Turkey. So synthetic Israel was actually created by a colleague of mine in the government department for the purpose of finding a kind of series of donor countries which, if you put them all together, tracked Israel's growth completely from the year 1980 to the year 2000. Why am I telling you this? Because if you look at how synthetic Israel has done since the Intifada of 2000, and compare, if you look how synthetic Israel and look how Israel has actually done, the gap actually amounts to over 10 years amounts to an entire year of GDP, which for the government of Israel would have been something like $70 billion to spend on public policy. What can account for that gap? It seems to me that part of what Israel is struggling against, part of the problem of swimming upstream, is that even though it's true Israel's knowledge sector has been doing very well, and even though it's true that it's been tracking the OECD average and even better, it's also true that the personal relationships that Israelis need to create extremely robust startup businesses, the personal relationships that need to be developed, which was reflected in the original relationships it had with these global companies during the Oslo process, those personal relationships are suffering. They're not necessarily suffering in a way as to make the economy a failure. Certainly not a failure. We're talking about marginal differences. The difference between growing at 3.5% and growing at 6%. Marginal differences that seem to me the result of more and more global companies finding it difficult to work with Israeli companies, not in a big dramatic way, but in quiet ways. Product development groups at Siemens that might otherwise have been willing to work with an Israeli solutions company, which, if it has an alternative, it's not true of Iskar, if it has an alternative, they'll work with a company in Santa Clara or in Phoenix or in Bangalore if they can avoid working with an Israeli company. This issue needs to be acknowledged. Israel has to grow much more quickly than it has been growing, and if it's not growing at that pace, it's partly because of the sense of allergy that some people in the global intelligentsia are feeling about Israel owing to policies that I need not to go into here. So, let's acknowledge that the success story is also a story that's been foiled to some extent by an increasing tendency to isolate Israel politically, which is going to have economic consequences.
Thank you. Once again, an opportunity for a quick question to Bernie. Very provocative thesis where you ended up. I have a quick question just to compare. If I think about America, it's universities that become the ecosystem. And you think of what's going on in Palo Alto and Cambridge, and even here to a slightly lesser extent, but still happening. And Jamie will tell us more about that. Within Israel, is that not also the case with leading universities being kind of a driver of the ecosystem? And maybe the right way to ask the question is,
Nava will talk about that.
Nava will talk about that, sure.
is it enough? If we have companies leaving or not engaging as much as you're suggesting is part of the reason why growth might not have been as high as it
I guess the point I want to emphasize is that business relationships are personal, and they entail extremely complicated, in some cases, very highly scientific conversations around problems that need to be solved. And you cannot alienate the world's intelligentsia and not feel the reaction. It's also happening in the global companies. I'm not saying that if Israelis have a technology that can't be found anywhere else, people will, avoid buying Israeli products. If you've got a cure for diabetes or something and you're an Israeli company, you'll be fine. I'm talking about building personal relationships like the ones that are built out from the activities of global companies through the 90s. Those personal relationships, those windows on product development initiatives, when they start closing down, not all at once, but one window at a time, you're going to feel it in opportunities for entrepreneurial businesses.
It's about the talent machine that you're
It's the talent machine and the conversations that talent has.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Nava, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. 3:10. That's quite a challenge. I will spend the next, hopefully, 12 minutes or so talking about a subset of the innovation ecosystem, specifically that which has to do with the interface of academia and industry. I will mention very briefly some of the government support programs that go around that. And with your permission, Mr. Chairman, Moderator, I will skip those slides which I added after our conversation, because I feel that most of that, which is more about the ecosystem, has been covered this morning and in the later morning by Dean, by Guy, by others. So I think you know most of what there is to know about where we are now. I will highlight an area that you might know a little less about, and which I think is relevant, especially to the topic of this seminar, of coming from a small country and growing an entrepreneurial environment. This is supposed to work. Yeah, no, I'm pressing the button.
Is it the other clicker?
The other one goes back. Oh, it's this one.
Okay,
Hang on.
great.
That's the Mac.
There we go.
Right. Well, you all know this, Israel Inside, lots of companies that have grown up in Israel. I will highlight a subset of these which actually came out of Israeli academia. There'll be a separate slide, but just to mention, even at this early stage, Netafim, the drip irrigation, which everyone knows is associated with Israel, classic agricultural technology, but one which has grown and continues, incidentally, to grow around the world, came out of the Faculty of Agriculture at the Hebrew University. Sadly, not patented, so no royalties, but a lot of the research was done there almost 50 years ago now, actually. Tomatoes, peppers, medications, I'll talk more about those, but a lot of what you see on the slide, and of course one of our most successful spin-off companies, Jamie, you'd like to have one of those down at the bottom right-hand side of the slide, Mobileye. Driver assist systems raised $1 billion, an IPO on NASDAQ, and today are actually traded at a market value which is higher than Israel's largest bank. we can discuss that, but that is in fact a fact. Also, incidentally, a spin-off from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. We have talked about the high venture capital availability. Mine is to scale, Yadin, so you can see the difference between here the US and Israel. Close to 5,000 active tech companies, $2 billion a year, all of that we know. We've discussed this as well. You've seen that was especially for you actually before I came over. Over 250, a guy told me over 300 now, multinational R&D centers, employing again around 50,000 people, which is a significant number in the Israeli workforce, not big enough maybe, but a reasonable number. Importantly, many of these were established through acquisition of Israeli companies, and that's a trend that's growing in recent years, and again is very relevant to what Bernie was saying just now. Companies not just acquiring companies in Israel and taking the people with them, but establishing facilities, R&D centers, growing their presence in Israel. And no, it's not just the acquisition of Waze by Google, which is very well known because they insisted on maintaining operations in Israel. And there were rumors that they had declined the initial offer from Facebook because they wanted to take the company to the Valley, and Google was willing to maintain the operations in Israel. Not just that, but if you look back 15 years ago to the acquisition of the first 10 companies in Israel, those were the origin of some of the significant medical device activity that we have in the country today. So it's not just a new phenomenon. You know these statistics, I won't go over them, but we're certainly an innovation powerhouse on lots of different parameters. We're tiny, about the same size as New Hampshire, actually. Sorry, I'm going to run through these. Okay, I do want to say a few words about this smart government intervention. We have been fortunate in that respect. The Office of the Chief Scientist was mentioned. Really, the Office of the Chief Scientist is not a program. It is an agency. It is our national R&D agency. It administers pretty much all of the programs, including the Bird Foundation and 48 other binational programs that we have with many countries and regions around the world. Tend to be programs where both sides put in some money, and joint R&D programs, industrial R&D programs, get funded and in theory pay back royalties. The royalty model works well with Bird, not that well with some of the others, but they're also newer programs. The venture industry was mentioned earlier, again created by the government under the Office of the Chief Scientist at the time, very successful program. The incubators, which started out as a job creation scheme to absorb these million immigrants that were mentioned this morning from the former Soviet republics, and have turned into a great engine of growth for the Israeli entrepreneurial system. Over 20 incubators, mostly today privatized. What you see interesting in the incubators is a disproportionate number of life science companies versus ICT companies. And why is that? If you add up biotech, medical tools, and medical devices, you get to over 50% of the companies in the incubators. There are not 50% of all startups in Israel, but they are the startups that are most difficult to fund. And therefore, the government plays an important role in getting that early stage funding to a sector that is successful, mostly the devices, less so on the business side, the biotech. But the funding goes into these companies and they get started. They get sold relatively early. That's been discussed. I'll go back to that also. But at least they do get the initial funding, which is a little more difficult than the ICT sector. We have very innovative industry academia support programs, again administered under a section of the Office of the Chief Scientist. Some of the best actually that I've come across in all the international work that I've done. And they go from very small programs to support initial proof of concept work, so one academic working with one company. There'll be very small grants, all the way through to large consortia of several academic institutions and several companies creating platform technologies on everything from stem cells to fourth generation communications and pretty much everything in between. There are evolving policies that change as the time goes by, addressing certain market needs. And one of these, and I didn't actually put this in after we spoke, Bernie, this was there before. One of these is the multinational program. Under the Office of the Chief Scientist, they sign agreements with many of the multinationals that were on that earlier slide, and they are able to get additional government funding, sometimes even as much as dollar for dollar or even more, for R&D programs with an industrial application that they do with Israeli startups. All of these programs are essentially meant to boost that industrial-focused R&D coming out of Israel. Certain strategic initiatives that vary. I happen to know a little about the nanotechnology initiative, which I'll mention only focuses a lot not just on creating excellent science and 6 centers at the universities, but also on collaborating with industry from the very, very early stages of research. And that, you'll see, I think I have a slide. I've mentioned most of these. I'm not going to go into the details, but the copies are available for those who want to have a look. I'll mention just one thing here on the nanotechnology, just as an example. First 6 years of that program, what you see, interestingly, is not just 7,500 published scientific papers in leading journals, which is an impressive number in and of itself. But if you look at the number below, 20% of those, and remember this is early stage academic research, a full 20% of those were done in collaboration with industry, already at the early stages. We track the collaboration with industry, we track the numbers of patents, the numbers of companies, the numbers of commercialized technologies, and that's one of the reasons for this close interaction between the two. Now, admittedly, Israel is a small country. We have 8 research universities. I mean, you know, it's a small number. We now have many colleges, but they don't tend to do basic research. Basic research is carried out at 8 universities, in fact, 6 or 7 of the 8 mostly, the 8th being the Open University, which is considered a research university but doesn't really do any of the exact sciences. It's mostly social sciences. So how do we do it? These are some of the current statistics. I have a few more. Interestingly, the government just published a whole lot of statistics on technology transfer and commercialization, which I'll show you in a moment. But Israel's been a world pioneer in technology transfer, academic technology transfer in the classic sense of taking technology from academia, taking those research results, turning them into products or services for which someone is willing to pay. Okay, classic cycle, and then the proceeds of that, usually royalties, sometimes equity-based, will go back into funding additional academic research. The Bayh-Dole Act, which is the basis for technology transfer in this country, was enacted in 1980. So we've been doing this 20 plus years before, which is partly why today we're in a good place. We're in a good place because practice does make perfect, and we've had more practice than any other region in the world. Just by way of comparison, Europe started doing it in the 90s, Japan in around 2000, and so we made mistakes, but we made them early on when no one was looking. So by now we have a pretty well-established system that works. We have 2 of the world's top tech transfer companies in absolute dollar terms, not per capita or per research dollar or anything, over $20 billion in annual sales of products, over $500 million in revenues that come in annually. And this is combined among the different universities, hundreds of spin-off companies, and many that can be mentioned here. Traditionally, the big money makers are drugs. We have cancer medications. We have Alzheimer's medications. We have multiple sclerosis medications. We have multiple sclerosis medications. In fact, over half the world's multiple sclerosis population takes medications that were developed in Israeli academic institutions. Not necessarily the same medications, but that's just an interesting statistics. We have the encryption algorithms, INDS, Mobileye, which I mentioned before, driver assist systems, which is embedded today in many of the new luxury cars, and also hopefully not so much luxury cars because it's very important. Few numbers that I'll throw out at you so that you can ask questions later on. Just gives you an idea. Invention disclosures, that is the initial disclosure, that's the term that's used by an academic, a researcher in an academic institution. In fact, can also be a hospital, but usually these are universities and research institutes saying, I've discovered something interesting. And that goes to the tech transfer company, which then makes a decision as to whether or not they're going to submit a patent application. That's the difference between the first line and the second line. License agreements, again, this can be a little misleading because these are 2012 figures, but the license agreements, of course, relate to technologies from many years previous to that. It's not just from that 1 year. That's why the number is higher than the number of patent applications. Still a very big number. Spin-off companies in that particular year, and I would argue, I think anyone who's been in this business for any length of time would argue that probably 10%, if you're generous, maybe 15% of the discoveries are relevant for the creation of a spin-off company. The remaining 85 to 90% should be licensed out to existing companies. And starting a company around every single invention is just a waste of a whole lot of resources. And I know it's very popular, and I know regional development agencies love starting companies because it's something that you can count and measure. But more often than not, those will not succeed in the long term. And there are ample examples from your home province of Quebec, from Germany, from Singapore, and even from Israel, certain years where this was very popular. And at the bottom, the IP-related revenues in that given year. Interestingly, this slide, and again, these numbers come from the Central Bureau of Statistics. In Israel, they were released at the end of August of this year. I didn't invent them, I'm just bringing them to you. And I did highlight two numbers that are particularly interesting. They take the numbers that were shown on the previous slides and some additional data points. They are normalized across the different countries looking at purchasing power parity. You can see that at the top. And you'd expect Israel to be much smaller in terms of research spending, because it is obviously a smaller country. You can see the percentage of invention disclosures normalized vis-a-vis that, which is pretty much similar, around 40%. You can see the number of patent applications. Again, we submit many patent applications, say versus the UK or the US, but again, not terribly surprising. Mm-hmm. But look at the commercialization ratio. Look at the number of licenses. Double the UK and Japan, and several-fold what happens in the US. So in this area, at least, Glenn, we are very productive in terms of our productivity in getting the technologies out the door and into the market. Spin-off companies' numbers are fairly similar. IP-related revenues, again, off the charts. If you look at what we're bringing in based on our research, as opposed to what we're spending on research, we are in a very good place. How we do this? I'm going to put this up, then you're going to ask questions. We have a slightly different model than that which is common in the US and in other countries. Our technology transfer organizations, our commercialization companies, are set up as companies that operate like a for-profit company. They are wholly owned by the university or the research institute, but they are governed by an independent board. And in some cases, like, for example, the Hebrew University, the university chooses to have minority representation on the board. They bring in an outside chairman. These are all voluntary boards. They have some of the top business people in the country to help out, but they operate as independent companies. We own the intellectual property that is similar to the US. There's an agreement between the company and the university. The intellectual property is owned by the company, but if they are successful in commercializing it, the researchers are very, very well compensated, roughly double what is common in the US. 40 to 60% goes to the researchers. The remainder is split between the company and the university on a certain scale. Very important point is that second to last point. We provide a one-stop shop for industry. So if your company, if your Coca-Cola, say, which is a true example, is looking for some help with certain research aspects. In the US, they'd usually come to the Office of Industry Relations, and that is completely separate from the Office of Technology Licensing. They're not in the same place, they're not the same people. And they might have some sort of research agreement, but it'll never materialize into an eventual license because they're completely different sides of the organization. What we do is we have it all in one place. So we'll start with a small license or a small service agreement, small research agreement. We will eventually grow into a collaborative relationship. We understand the companies today are not likely to come and take what you have on the shelf, but they want to create a collaborative relationship. It's been mentioned before, we have good academic institutions, we have good researchers, we have something to offer. And so everything, including in most cases also consulting arrangements, individual consulting arrangements provided by the faculty for the company they're working with, will all be managed under the same roof so that we can then take that and grow the relationship with, of course, a team of experts, business people. And the focus, of course, is on royalties. I don't think universities are venture investors. I came to the university environment when I originally did from many years in venture capital, and I have a very strong belief that those are two separate businesses. Ending with this, these are my key success factors for successful academia-industry collaboration and why I think it works relatively well in Israel. We create the right environment. We strive to create the right environment. There's always room to improve. But we have business-focused organizations. We have clear IP ownership. We have generous revenue-sharing policies. I do believe greed is important. I really do. I think that if you're successful, if your research leads to a successfully commercialized product, you should be very, very well compensated, personally, because that creates a whole effect around you that provides more and more interesting research results to the outside world from the university. The last point is probably the most important on this slide. An excellent team, and an excellent team which you can hire and fire. These are not university administrators. These are people who are hired into the company, by the company, and can be fired by the company. Because what you need is business people, people with business acumen, business development experts, licensing experts. What you don't need is an administrator who will push paper around. That's not what these companies do. And they're usually very sparsely staffed, so each person counts. If you've got very few people, they have to be able to deliver. And of course, having done all of that, it does help if you get lucky. I can tell lots of stories of doing everything right and it doesn't work out. We all know that. So getting lucky does help. I'm going to end at this point. There's a little more information for those who are interested at the question stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nava. It's actually a pretty good segue, isn't it, to Jamie and talking about some of what we're doing here at Dartmouth, and maybe some reaction to what you heard as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sid. So I had the lucky, I guess, task of trying to synthesize this wonderful discussion, so thank you all. So I thought I would maybe do a few things. One, just share with you some about what we're actually doing here at Dartmouth around entrepreneurship and innovation and incubation. Second, try to draw some parallels. I don't profess to be an expert around the country of Israel, but I think there are definitely some parallels to draw about building these ecosystems. What are the elements of the ecosystem that seems to be covered here, as well as what we're faced here at Dartmouth, as well as the state of New Hampshire. So just as a, again, way of kind of introduction to kind of orient you. So I come at this from the vantage point of, first and foremost, an entrepreneur. So when I did my undergraduate studies, I built a technology-oriented company, ended up exiting that company. And so I think that's important in these discussions to kind of define the lens at which we see the world. So I definitely see it very as opportunistic and from the entrepreneurial perspective. But several years ago, gained a little bit of expertise around the art of incubation and incubators. So the creation of these facility-oriented groupings of entrepreneurs, the resources, the design, and the ultimate ecosystem to hopefully enhance and accelerate venture creation. So what are we doing at Dartmouth? About a year ago at the college, a new office was created, which is known as the Office of Entrepreneurship and Technology Transfer. So Dartmouth historically has had a little bit of offerings, some programmatic support for entrepreneurs, for students, for faculty, for alums. That sat over here. And then it also had its formal technology transfer office that did several of the application uses that Nava suggested. What we've done is actually very unique within at least the Ivy League environment, which is have brought both of those under one roof. And the belief for that is the thesis that we're beginning to kind of, I guess, explore or experiment around is 4 ultimate talent to have Dartmouth and position Dartmouth as a further talent magnet. So what do I mean by that? So on the student side, that we can create an entrepreneurial environment here at Dartmouth, a destination of sorts, and I think we have a lot of work to do around that, so that we can attract entrepreneurial-minded students to further explore and accelerate their ideas. And then on the faculty side, faculty that may be limited in terms of how much you can pay them, the research dollars you can give them from a recruiting angle. How do we actually attract the world's best faculty in this competitive and growing competitive marketplace? And one of the ways we are beginning to imagine that is the potential creation of a technology transfer policy in which maybe there's a world that exists in which the inventor, that faculty member, owns close to 100% of their intellectual property rights. So those are just a little bit of the aspects that we're beginning to think about. So my responsibility within this new Office of Entrepreneurship and Technology Transfer is the entrepreneurial arm. And what we've set out to do has been first and foremost to actually bring some form and definition to what we mean here at Dartmouth about entrepreneurship. And I think I would maybe echo some of the commentary, but maybe I'll call it out, is this topic of entrepreneurship, this topic about ecosystems, innovation, and the creation of startups is very hot right now, or it's been maybe hot for the past 5-10 years. And our responsibility is, again, how do we actually go about defining that? And one way I believe we define that is actually by giving entrepreneurship in a local community or a local ecosystem place. And so what we set out to do about a year ago as part of this new effort was to actually build one of the first on-campus incubators that would be in service and support of students, both undergrads and grads, faculty, staff, alums, and then the greater community. And that's actually something that is fairly unique here at Dartmouth, is that broad scope of who we're actually going to begin to identify and service. Right, so we're kind of creating a target audience or a stakeholder base that is very broad. And then secondly, we're going very broad on our definition of entrepreneurship, that it's above and beyond, I would say, maybe the stigma of for-profit technology to the ability to take one's idea, articulate that, and then begin to assemble the resources needed to move that into reality. So for-profit technology definitely fits that, but also social ventures and sustainable ventures, arts and entertainment, right? These are all aspects that we want to begin to kind of service and support. All of that because we think the skill set ultimately, and within this educational ecosystem, the skill set of the 21st century is an entrepreneurial thought process. And that we would do well as an institution to share that knowledge and skill sets with the art student to the engineer, to the faculty in the humanities, to the faculty in computer science, and across the board. And that by gathering all those people together and putting them into one location and one locale, good things can begin to come from that. So our metrics is not encouraging everybody to start a new venture in a dorm room. It's to begin to kind of change a culture and try to extract from all this talent that we have here. I sometimes liken universities or colleges as one of the first incubators, right? The first experiment of putting people together and seeing what comes from that. Together in the hopes that big ideas can come from that. So allow me for a second just to, wrote some comments down just to kind of highlight some of the speakers. Glenn, I thought one aspect that I took from yours was this recognition of the population, obviously, of Israel being on the younger side. And I would say that seems to obviously be an advantage. And you didn't necessarily call it out, but you made the parallel to selling out earlier, creating this sweatshop mentality. I'd be very curious to what extent is Israel focused on, or the academic institutions or these various specific ecosystems, focused on building culture. Mm-hmm. Building culture around reasons to maybe stay and continue to build your business or your venture in Israel.
Well, the most direct way and the most successful way is the government, and that's maybe what you're missing in the incubator model you were describing, is hard investment dollars. The government, aside from the incentives program, the royalties program, on the patent side, patent productivity has never been a problem. It's just off the charts. It's the capital productivity of the patents in terms of firm formation and the capital productivity of invested capital. Where the government has just been brilliant, I mean, from Maude days onwards, is to be an active investor. I mean, in the structure of the Life Sciences Fund that we did, it was sort of a modified USMA structure, but was trying to overcome the lack of translating patent productivity to capital productivity in the life sciences industry. So the government comes in as a limited partner, had a bunch of arguments, got thrown down the stairs of the Ministry of Finance because we said we needed $1 billion, and they said, well, we maybe put 100 on the table. So $50 million comes in as a limited partnership. The tender was written to provide a first loss position that limited partner, the government, would take, because we were able to prove to the Office of Management and Budget it would get returns that were not firm related, but tax revenues and other revenues that would be related to that. Prove that issue out, and then also provide a liquidity preference to the private investors that would be leveraged off of it. The tender went out. OrbiMed was the largest health private equity firm at about $5 billion out of New York. Had never invested a dime in Israel. Common has run that fund currently. But it's an example, but that's been replicated. The Alba Water Fund, which is a fund focused on another one that came out of the General Accountant's Office and focused on, and the Prime Minister's Office. The Fuel Choice Funds, there's 2 co-investment funds there. There's an agri-tech fund. There's going to be a health IT fund. And so there's ways of just being an activist investor. The government's an activist investor. It's there's government meddling. It's not meddling, it's government enabling to leverage and attract private capital into that as a partner. Our question is, how do we move that into having private equity in the public markets, such as a long-term high-tech fund that could be managed as very much like a business development corporation. BDCs go public here all the time and provide private equity through the public market and attract institutional investors from abroad and so forth. And that's the sort of thing that we see as a potential solution to that capital gap. But here, I don't think it's just culture. It's you build culture by investing in it.
Yeah, and I guess I was maybe more referring to, so our situation is we potentially invest the time, energy, resources in orienting students and faculty to build these new ventures. And what is the cultural element that we're investing in that maybe encourages them to stay here in New Hampshire as opposed to go to the Valley?
Well, that would be
and the same question, I think, is Israel. As you pointed out, there is sometimes this exodus of the companies to go to the Valley or to the U.S. to ultimately set up shop. What was the cultural uniqueness of, say, ways to remain and invest?
But it's really, to me, it's very simple. At the end of the day, firstly, I agree with what Liat said earlier today. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have Israeli ambassadors in different parts of the world, Israeli entrepreneurs who live and work in different places. But I can tell you from my own personal experience, I spent 10 years living in Europe and the States. I lived in the Valley. I moved back to Israel from San Francisco. My sanity was often questioned. But the point is, I moved back because that's where I wanted to live, and that's where I eventually wanted to raise my children. And I think that's common to most Israelis. If you speak to them at the end of the day, people want to be home. At a certain point in your life, most people want to be home, and Israel is home. And
well, I'm glad you clarified that. I read it as that there was an exodus of those ventures leaving.
Not necessarily. They will operate internationally. Sometimes the management will be elsewhere. And very often, these people will come back. I know many of these people. Some of them I know, from way back. And it's important to them to create a life, a good life in Israel. So I don't think it's necessarily just a bad thing. Israel's not an easy place to live in, but it has its advantages as well. So I think there's actually more of a question when you're in New Hampshire, and Boston's 2 hours away and might offer easier access to talent and easier access to capital. And frankly, easier access to moving around, just transport and getting places and so on. New York's not that far away.
Sure.
I think you have a bigger challenge of
Well,
preserving
that's
people.
why personally I highlight the term culture and what one does to begin to invest in that in your local area. And it's not always bottom line related materials to the new venture, right? It's either home or tied to the land and the people, to the potential work-life balance, et cetera. And you see that in I think the growing secondary and tertiary markets within the US, in which people are migrating away from the valley to places like Boulder, Colorado, and setting up ecosystems and developing ecosystems there. Because it's not always the access to the talent and the resources per se. There is this kind of this cultural, environmental attitude as well.
I think in America there's these hotspots that are forming all over the place now, where there's a startup culture forming, which is kind of interesting. You mentioned Boulder, Portland, Maine. Of course, Silicon Alley in New York is well known, has been that way for a while.
Richard Florida had
In
a
Florida
terrific. Richard Florida had a terrific article about that. in
Oh yes, he
Atlantic.
talked about the growth
But one
of
of
cities.
apropos Richard Florida, he was the one who pointed out that the growth rates of such places is something like 10% a year, which is more like what Israel needs.
Yeah.
I mean, Israel's own hotspots, it's more like what they have. So comparing, as I said before, to the OECD is really sort of begging the question.
Right. I want to make sure, Tom, you have a chance to kind of wrap up in your comments, because we want to watch our clock and have a chance
Jamie,
for a slight break before the keynote.
Bernie, I would highly, I think, agree with you in terms of the attraction of corporations. Obviously, Neva, you touched upon just the balance of the educational networks. And I'd be curious to know, because I think we reflect on this here within just the region, and specifically the state of New Hampshire, is this homegrown attitude of new ventures versus the classic kind of economic model of the attracting of established companies. And I think, at least here at Dartmouth and Hanover, we've had the most success of bringing established companies in via acquisition. So I'm glad actually several of you touched upon that with respect to a way to attract some more of these established companies.
You need both, and you need both because they provide different aspects. Okay, they're not doing the same thing for you. It's like saying that your academic experts know all there is to know about, I don't know, new types of computer processors, okay? But if they are not in constant dialogue with the companies operating in that field, their research will be divorced from reality.
Right.
And I have seen very good examples of that happening. And so it's not just that industry needs academia to provide it with research and future ideas and patents and developments. Academia needs industry to provide it with a reality check, with an understanding of the markets, with what the needs are. It's a two-way street. And by the same token, multinationals versus locally grown national companies, they're all part of the same system, and you need them all.
And big companies today are not sort of big pyramids. Big companies are swarms of initiatives. I mean, you can have some terrifically entrepreneurial activity inside of big companies. Thinking about entrepreneurship purely in terms of startups, I think, is a huge mistake. Big companies, Cisco, I mean, famously, Chambers of Cisco says he doesn't even know the product line of Cisco anymore. I mean, Cisco makes hundreds of products that the CEO doesn't even know about. Mm-hmm. So you have, and many of these teams that are forming inside of these companies are competing with one another, right? I mean, actually, you mentioned this yourself last night, Eitan, over dinner, that you have teams inside of ISCAR that are actually competing with one another. That's true even in the automobile industry, where you have design hubs throughout Volkswagen that are competing to create new cars that wind up, on the whole, grabbing market share that would be denied to Fiat, say. But they're competing with one another, and that's the way they keep their innovation engines going. So big companies that operate in Israel are not necessarily not startups. They're not necessarily not entrepreneurial companies. They can be very entrepreneurial teams, and they can be selling into the larger network created by that company, either as a startup or as a local team.
Well, the spillover effects are really strong for to sharpen your point about the R&D centers. It's just thinking, you mentioned Cisco, so those of you who are from Israel know that she could tell the story much better than I, but Zika Abzug, who was head of business development for Chambers there. And she started to, did an initial $15 million investment in outsourcing in Ramallah to Amal and to some of the other firms there. HP and Google came in afterwards and added about another $10 million. It was done as a corporate, she just also did the numbers, checked out what the outsourcing of programming to India was worth versus outsourcing down the street. And that moved the technology sector's contribution to the Palestinian Authority's GDP from 0.8% to 10%, which is, you know, about 100, no, I'm sorry, it's close to $1 billion, you know, it's $10 billion.
That's an interesting number. Well, on that,
10%, it's $100 billion GDP there, so.
no, but on that point, just an interesting anecdote. I was in Shanghai last week and talking about business incubation with a group of people from, well, pretty much all over the world. And at some point, someone raised their hand, someone from Malaysia, and said, we're interested in technology transfer from big multinationals into our universities because they have better R&D capabilities, in fact, better basic research capabilities than most of our universities. So our universities need to learn from these multinationals, and how do we attract them, which is really sort of the complete reverse of everything we have in mind in the US, in Israel, most of the Western world when we think of tech transfer.
Coca-Cola setting up a technology center in Israel. Coca-Cola has like 2,000 people in their strategic marketing group who know more about teenagers around the world than all the sociology departments put together.
Well, Coca-Cola's interested in water. That's really where Coca-Cola's out for it. And so the water technology is what feeds their interest in Israel there. So.
Yeah, but I also, when I was running, Yisum had one of, well, a large beverage company, which shall remain unnamed, asked to license one of our technologies. And everyone was quite chuffed because, you know, this was a big name and it was a nice license. And then we realized what they really wanted to do was put it on the shelf. They wanted to license it in order to kill it so that the other large unnamed beverage company won't have access to it. So, you know, that happens too. And universities can be just, you know, a player, even an almost passive player in this big competitive game.
To be an active investor.
You know, if there's one, I'm just going to make one kind of final comment. It's kind of interesting about some of what I'm learning from listening to this discussion. It's obvious that what's going on in Israel is an opportunity to actually export that knowledge to countries like America and many others for that matter. It's an example of reverse innovation, which my colleague Vijay Govindarajan has written extensively about. Innovation coming from, in his case, he looked a lot at innovations in India and how those innovations actually can be and should be exported to America and Western Europe and other advanced economies because they're looking at it in a completely different way because they're resource constrained, different culture, different. It's the same type of thing when we come to kind of entrepreneurship that we're talking about here and startup logic. I think the interplay between big companies, universities, startup environment, talent, there's really a tremendous opportunity. So I think on that note, I want to thank the entire panel really for a great discussion.